Right. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Isabella McAllister from the University of Auckland, presenting belief revision about logic. Please take it away, Isabella.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about belief revision about logic. Before I get started, it might be worth asking or clarifying what I mean by belief revision about logic. This is the kind of change in belief about which logical principles might count as correct. So sometimes people might say stuff like, I used to think that the principle of bivalence was universally valid, but I changed my mind. I used to think that there were no true contradictions, but I changed my mind. These type of change in beliefs. And it turns out that traditional belief revision systems have a very difficult time modeling this type of belief revision because they don't accommodate change in logic. And so that's what this talk is hopefully trying to fill, a little gap, and come up with a system that can handle this type of belief change. So just a bit of looking ahead at what we're going to do. I'll briefly go over some information about traditional belief revision, in particular belief revision in the AGM tradition. I'm not going to touch on any kind of modal logic type belief revision or probabilistic type belief revision. And I'll talk about why it doesn't really do the job we need it to do and why we need some new machinery. Then I'll set up the actual system itself and go through some details and some possible problems. Then when I set up the main system, I'll focus on just one particular type of revision operator. Then after that, I'll consider some ways we might be able to generalize that operator or some alternatives to it that might be better in certain ways. And then if there's time, I'll just go over some technical results that kind of might relate to traditional AGM or some possible concerns that we might have with the system and ways in which we might be able to move forward. All right, so traditional AGM, the kind of hallmark paper is on the logic of theory change by Alcuron, Gardenforth, and Mackinson. The core objects in traditional belief revision system are belief sets. Belief sets are just collections of information, like collections of formulas, and traditionally they're closed under classical logic. The idea behind belief sets is that if a formula is in a belief set, that's interpreted to mean something like you believe that formula. Because belief sets are closed under classical logic, and ordinarily people don't always consciously believe every classical consequence of their non-logical beliefs. Sometimes belief in this context is kind of reinterpreted as something like commitment to belief. So sometimes people say that a formula is in a belief set means that you're committed to believing that. Whether or not that's an okay way of getting around some of the problems of classical closure, it's not really relevant, and I'm not going to try and defend or argue against it. But those are the kind of main objects that we work with. And there are three main kinds of operations that traditional AGM is concerned with. There's expansion, where you add a belief to your collection of beliefs. There's contraction, where you remove a belief from your collection of beliefs. And there's revision, where you try and consistently add a belief. Expansion doesn't generally preserve consistency. So again, because belief sets are traditionally closed under classical logic, if I believe that not P, and then I expand by P, the resulting belief set will trivialize. Whereas revision, the goal is to try and avoid that by first removing all of the information that conflicts with the new belief, and then adding the new belief to your collection of beliefs. So sometimes revision is often expressed as using the Levi identity, which is where you first contract and then expand. You contract by information that conflicts with the new belief, then you expand by the new belief itself. Thinking more generally, we just want to kind of revision involves adding a belief in a way that doesn't result in triviality, essentially. So just as a quick example of what traditional belief might look like, many of you are probably sick of hearing about the election. I'll force you to suffer through it a little bit longer. So on election night, I believed that Trump would win, but as votes were counted over the next few days, I came to believe that Biden would win. This is a belief that a lot of people seem to have held. And it's this kind of belief revision is something that traditional AGM can handle okay. So first, what we do is that to model this revision, we first remove beliefs that are incompatible with the belief that Biden will win. So beliefs like that Biden will lose key swing states, that Trump will win, that Biden won't get enough electoral votes, etc. We need to remove all those beliefs first, and then we add the belief that Biden will win. Because if we don't remove the beliefs, these incompatible beliefs first, then we're going to have a resulting belief set that contains information like both Trump and Biden will win, and that's bad, and that it's not really accurate. So that would be like the traditional process of revision for modeling this kind of belief revision. And the AGM handles it okay. Traditional AGM handles it okay. But then if we turn to some certain beliefs about logic, things are less clear. So if you take this example, I used to think that the law of excluded middle was correct or valid, universally correct, but now I'm not so sure. So if we wanted to try and model this type of revision in traditional AGM, how would we try and do it? First, do we add anything? Do we remove stuff? And if we do, what is it that we're adding or removing? So it seems that we're kind of removing the belief that the law of excluded middle is correct. But it's not clear how to do that in the case of traditional AGM because belief sets are all closed under classical logic. So if we were trying to kind of model removing the law of excluded middle by like, say, removing particular instances of excluded middle. So you might think that excluded middle fails because of certain cases, so you try and remove those cases from a belief set. Perhaps we might try and do that, but we can't do that because belief sets are closed under classical logic. We can't remove any classical validities. Nor can we kind of remove any kind of general principle about the law of excluded middle because belief sets only contain individual formulas. They don't contain these kind of general rules. And it's much, we can't really do it because it conflicts with the background assumption that all classical validities are contained in the belief set. And it's worth noting that we can't really get around this problem by adopting some non-classical AGM system. So we might think, okay, maybe this is just a problem for classical logic. Let's just move to an intuitionistic AGM type system. And then we can model this type of belief change. So for example, there are intuitionistic AGM belief revision systems, but that kind of just pushes the general problem back. So if we adopt an intuitionistic AGM system, we might be able to model a failure of excluded middle, but we can't model failures of intuitionistic logic. So maybe I want to, if we adopt intuitionistic framework, maybe I then decide that I want to abandon, I don't know, the law of non-contradiction or something. Each case, the main problem is that there's some fixed background logic that we can't break, essentially. And simply rejecting classical logic won't do. We need a much more general framework where we can move around the background closures of the belief sets, where we can switch between which logics close our belief sets fluidly and smoothly, and which there's an incredibly general, and that we have a lot of options. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Looking forward a little bit, the general way in which belief revision will occur is that we'll have a belief set, it's just a set of formulas closed under some logic, and revising to a new logic will involve changing the closure operator for that belief set while preserving various bits of information. So belief revision about logic will consist of changing the background logic for your belief set. But before we get to that, we should probably pause and consider some general principles or postulates we might want a belief revision operator to obey. In traditional AGM, there are various, well, both in like the classical case and all the non-classical cases, there's various postulates that we would expect a belief revision operator to obey. And so these are kind of some analogs that I think are a good foundation for what a belief revision operator about logic should obey. So the first one is closure. The new belief set should be closed under the new logic. This is probably the most basic condition that you could have. If the new belief set is closed under the new logic, this means that all of the new logic's tautologies or the theorems of the new logic will be in the new belief set, and all of various consequences that we can use the new logic to derive will also be contained in the new belief set. It might be worth noting that sometimes in traditional belief revision, the closure condition is criticized for being way too idealistic or unrealistic. I mentioned it earlier, people do not usually intentionally believe every logical consequence of their non-logical beliefs. And so sometimes closure has been criticized on these grounds. But in the case of belief revision about logic, we can it's less of an issue. I mentioned earlier that sometimes membership in a belief set is interpreted more along the lines of commitment to belief rather than intentional, actually kind of maintaining it in your mind and believing it. So that type of interpretation works quite well here. If you're committed to believing that certain logical principles are correct, you're committed to believing all the consequences of those logical principles. So by interpreting membership in a belief set as commitment to belief, we can kind of avoid questions of unrealisticness, since commitment to belief in a logic requires you to believe the consequences of all that logic, all those consequences of the logic. So that's the first condition, closure. The second one, coherency. So I say the new belief set is trivial, just in case the new logic is the trivial logic. So normally there are various kind of postulates that are consistency preserving postulates, inconsistency avoiding postulates in AGM systems that are paraconsistent. Usually triviality explicitly is the kind of marker of maximal badness. And so that's kind of what I'll work with here, since some of the background logics, or a lot of them, will be non-explosive. Yeah, so you might also think that, well, maybe we should say just we want the new belief set to be trivial at all costs. I think it's worth at least accommodating the possibility that someone might want to accept the trivial logic. They might not be particularly rational in doing so, but we lose very little by allowing this possibility. So this works fine. Well, the only case in which your new belief set should be trivial is if you're intentionally trying to make it trivial. That's the idea. You can't accidentally trivialize your belief set when revising beliefs about logic. That's this. This is the second postulate we might want a revision operator to obey. A third one, a bit longer. So everything in the new set is either a theorem of the new logic, non-logical information preserved from the old belief set, or the consequence of some non-logical information that's derived using the new logic. So essentially, everything in the new belief set originates from one of those three places. It's non-logical information preserved, it's a theorem of the new logic, or you're using the new logic to derive information from the non-logical information. This kind of postulate rules out any rogue information coming into the new belief set. We can't have random theorems from other logics. We won't suddenly come to believe that the moon is made of cheese when revising our beliefs about logic. It restricts where the information in the new belief set can come from. And finally, called maximality. So there's minimal loss of non-logical information through the revision. We could re-express there's maximal preservation of non-logical information through the revision. We want to preserve as much. The idea is that if we're only changing our beliefs about logic, we shouldn't lose non-logical beliefs, or at least we should lose as few as possible. This postulate is, I think it's good, but there are reasons why it might be problematic. So what I'm going to do is to try and set up a system where we can get a revision operator that's characterized by these four postulates. That'll be the main goal of the next however many minutes. And then I'll talk a bit more about whether maximality is too strong of a condition and how we might be able to kind of get operators that don't obey it in certain desirable ways. But first, the first task. We want an operator that's characterized by these postulates. So moving on to some of the formalism, if we're going to change beliefs about logic, we need to be clear on, well, what logics are, about what belief sets are, about what non-logical information is, and about what revision operators are supposed to be. So first, what are logics? By logics, I just mean a Tarskian consequence operator. This is just a set theoretic function on sets of formulas. I don't particularly care how the consequence operator is induced. All I care about is its behavior as a function. So there are lots of different equivalent ways, for example, of generating a classical consequence operator, generating the same classical consequence operator. I don't really care about all those different ways. All we care about in this context is the particular operator. And the language that we use is arbitrary. It could be propositional, it could be first order, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Tarskian operators, they're pretty weak conditions. They're also pretty common conditions when working with arbitrary logics. And the proofs for various results that I show later tend to heavily employ all of these conditions. So if you might want to like, you might be curious about whether there's like non-monotonic, what happens if we drop that, or if we drop other postulates. I'm just going to tell you in advance that we basically can't prove anything. And every time I try, I get frustrated and give up. So these are all used extensively in the proofs. And revision operators that don't assume these tend to be very, very weak. Okay, so belief sets. are just sets of formulas closed under some logic, namely some Tarskian consequence operator. And again, belief sets can contain, we don't care about which language is in question, it can be pretty much anyone. And two comments worth noting. Well, first, that every set of formulas for some language is closed under a Tarskian logic. So given some language, every set of formulas of the language is a belief set. And that belief sets can be closed under multiple logics at once. So if you have, if you close the empty set under a consequence operator for classical logic, you get the same resulting set as if you close the empty set under the consequence operator for LP. So in either case, all you get is just a bunch of theorems. And classical logic and LP have the same theorem, so we get the same set. That would be one example, but yeah, two things worth noting. And we'll index belief sets and consequence operators with the different logics to make the transitions clearer. Revision operators are functions that take a belief set and a logic and create a new belief set. This is just the general idea. The devil here is the devil is in the details here when it comes to how the revision operators are constructed, but generally speaking, they just take some set of formulas and a Tarskian consequence operator and get a new set of formulas.
Isabella, there's a clarificatory question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. All right. So we have belief sets, we have logics, we have revision operators generally. Now we just need to deal with what's non-logical information. So a first pass, there's a bit of a problem in that what counts as non-logical is ironically logic relative, in the sense that what might come across as non-logical in one sense turns out to be kind of equivalent or non-logical in another sense. So for example, P and not P are classically equivalent. They're not intuitionistically equivalent. So we might think that P and not P are both kind of, or we might think that one implies the other by means of logic in the classical case, but that's not necessarily the case in intuitionistic logic. So a first attempt at characterizing what non-logical information might be could be via belief bases. Historically, belief bases have been used to develop belief revision systems that in situations where closure is undesirable, say if there's computational restrictions or even if they're just philosophical objections to closure. Belief bases are kind of the smallest subsets of a belief set that imply that whole belief set. So each different belief sets usually have lots of different belief bases. For example, like the example I just gave, P, if we have a belief set that contains only or the only non-logical information, or that if P is a belief base for a belief set closed under classical logic, then not P will also be a belief base for that same belief set, as will P or P. That'll be a belief base for the same belief set. So this might be a first pass attempt, but unfortunately it doesn't quite work. So for example, suppose we had this belief set. The belief base for this set is, well, one belief base for this set is P, the set containing P and not P. This belief set is closed under LP, for example. Every belief base for this belief set will be inconsistent. And so if we're moving to classical logic and we're using entire belief bases as our non-logical information, we will have a problem preserving various non-logical information because we don't want our resulting belief set to be inconsistent. What we're going to need to do is to kind of split up the belief bases. of belief bases as a whole aren't really good enough. We need to kind of cut them up and move them around a bit in order to capture the idea of what non-logical information is. So that's what we're going to do. This kind of double B with the superscript KL is going to be denote the set of all non-logical information for a belief set K, and it's just the union of all the belief bases for K. So it's going to contain, it's likely that the collection of all non-logical information will contain a bunch of redundant information relative to L. For example, again, in the classical case, P is kind of redundant, or including both P and not P in a classical belief set, or is kind of redundant because they classically entail each other, but it's not necessarily redundant if we're considering, say, intuitionistic logic. Is not P does not entail P in an intuitionistic context. So what counts as kind of redundant relative to one logic might not be redundant to another logic. So we need to kind of take into account all the different non-logical information that we might have from one belief base. So that's what non-logical information we're going to work with. We have belief sets, we have logics, we have revision operators, we have non-logical information. Now we can put these all together and start formalizing the postulates I talked about at the beginning to eventually get a characterization result. So first is closure. If we have a belief set, we want to revise to a new logic, then that new belief set will just be closed under the new logic. Relatively straightforward, it's a direct analog of the traditional closure postulate. Second, coherency, again, pretty straightforward. The new belief set is trivial, just in case the new logic is the trivial logic. The only situation in which we will get a new trivial belief set is if the new logic is the trivial logic. We only trivialize if we're trying to trivialize. The next, the formalization of the origin postulate. There's some collection of non-logical information such that if we close that collection under the new logic, it'll be a superset of the new belief set. So this doesn't, it might not be clear immediately why this mirrors the English postulate, but the idea here is that if there's some such A that behaves like this, well, everything in the closure of A is going to be either non-logical information preserved from the old belief set, or theorems of the new set, theorems of the new logic, or consequences of the new logic in combination with the non-logical beliefs. And so if there's some such A, then, and the new belief set is a subset of that closure, that means that everything in the new belief set will also possess those properties, that everything in the new belief set will originate from one of those three places as well. So that's the idea here. Finally, the maximality postulate. Given some particular, given any bit of non-logical information, assuming the new logic is not the trivial logic, then that piece of non-logical information is omitted from the new belief set, just in case adding it to the new belief set would trivialize. Essentially, the only non-logical information that does not survive the revision is that which would trivialize the new belief set if it did survive. This postulate ensures that we preserve as much non-logical information as possible on pain of triviality. So those are how we kind of formally express these, or quasi-formally express these postulates with the machinery. Now let's try and get an operator that's characterized by these postulates. So the way that I'm going to construct an operator takes inspiration from the partial meet contraction operator in traditional AGM. Partial meet contraction in traditional AGM makes use of what's called a remainder set. Remainder set essentially is a way of, well, you generate a bunch of candidate new belief sets that are all as big as possible without implying the thing you don't want them to imply. If you're trying to remove some belief P from your belief set, these candidate new belief sets will all be as large as possible without implying P. And then partial meet contraction involves picking your favorite candidate new belief sets and taking what's common to them, taking their intersection. And so that's the general strategy we'll employ here, except the remainder set is constructed slightly differently because we're revising about different things. So this new remainder set is the collection of all these sets such that, well, essentially what we do is that we take a bunch of sets of non-logical information and we close all of them under the new logic. The remainder set is the set of all these closures that are non-trivial and that are maximal with respect to non-logical information. So each of the new candidate belief sets in this remainder set will contain as much, well, they will be non-trivial, and they'll be closed under the new logic, and they'll contain as much non-logical information as possible on pain of triviality. And if there are no such sets that exist, then we let the remainder set be just the set containing the set of all formulas. So this remainder set is used a lot, and it's how we can get our revision operator. As part of the process, we need preference orderings. So as I just mentioned, in traditional AGM, we generate a bunch of new candidate belief sets, we pick our favorite ones, and we take the intersection of those favorites. The preference ordering here does the same thing. What we do is we have a collection of candidate new belief sets, and this preference ordering allows us to pick our favorites. So I assume that the preference ordering is a total well-founded preorder. The preorder part is to try and capture some of the idea about preference. The total well-foundedness is we need it for technical reasons, but it also kind of it's compatible with the idea of preference. And one property that I don't assume holds of all preorders, but will be important, is what I call a semi-strict. So preference ordering is semi-strict whenever, given any set X and Y, if neither is a subset of the other, then one must be strictly more preferable than the other. So if X and Y if neither X or Y contains the other, then there can't be any preferential ties between X and Y. So this is a fairly strong condition on preference orderings, but it turns out that this is what we need in order to get an operator characterized by that satisfies the maximality postulate. So this will come up later. And using all this, putting it all together, we can generate a basic revision operator. What we do here over the course of the revision, we gather all the non-logical information from the old belief set. We generate all of the candidate new belief sets. These candidate new belief sets will be contained within the remainder set. The remainder set will be the set of all of them. And just to recap, these candidate new belief sets will be closed under new logic. They'll be as large, they'll contain as much non-logical information as possible without being trivial. Then once we have all these candidate new belief sets, we pick the best ones with the preference ordering. And there will always be some best ones since the since the preference ordering is well founded. And then we take the intersection of our favorites. So the idea with that is that if we have, say, some ties, some preferential ties among our favorites, and we can't decide which ones to pick, we just take what's in common to all of them. All right, so that's the basic operator. And I'll go through an example real quick of how it might work. Suppose we have this belief set, same one as before. It's closed under LP, it's inconsistent. We want to move from this belief set to classical logic. How do we do that? How do we do that in this framework? We gather all the non-logical information, which will be, we identify all the belief bases, we take the union of all these belief bases, and that gets us all the non-logical information. We generate the candidate new belief sets, and these candidates, it turns out, I think there'll only be 2 of them in this particular case. Since, well, they have to be non-trivial, so none of the candidate new belief sets can contain both P and not P, or contain anything that entails both P and not P. And they have to be maximal with respect to non-logical information. So they can't omit any bits of information on pain of triviality. So that means that there's going to be kind of 2 options. One in which there'll be a new classical belief set that generated from P and entails everything equivalent to P, and there'll be one generated from not P and everything equivalent to P. And those will be our 2 candidates. We pick our favorite one. Perhaps we think that, I don't know, not P is more plausible than P, and so we make that our favorite, just as an example. Then we take their common elements. In this case, since there's only one most favorite element, it'll just be, so if the candidate belief set generated from not P is our favorite, in this case, that will just become the new belief set. And however, in the event that, well, we'll get to this a bit in a couple slides later, but in the event that we have an equal preference between these 2 candidates, then we're going to lose basically all our non-logical information. Since neither of them contain, the belief set that contains P doesn't contain not P, the belief set that contains not P doesn't contain P. So if both of these are equally preferable, then we're going to lose all the non-logical information, and our new belief set will just be a set of theorems, which we might think could be problematic. And I'll get to that in a moment. So just some basic results about this revision operator. It satisfies 3 of the postulates that I think we should satisfy, but not maximality. And the reason it fails maximality is for what I just said. The preference ordering allows us to have preferences that result in massive information loss. So in this case, if these 2 candidates are equally preferable, then when we take, both of them will be in the minimum. They'll both be our favorite elements. So when we take their intersection, we're just gonna lose all the non-logical information we wanted to preserve. So that seems like a bad thing. How do we fix that? So in this case, the way that we fix that is by also requiring that the preference ordering is semi-strict. So semi-strictness is this property that I mentioned earlier. And what semi-strictness does is that it ensures that there's always a unique minimum element to the remainder set. If there's always a unique minimum element, then we can't have these kind of information conflicts between candidate belief sets. So we can't get candidate belief sets that when we take their intersection, we lose a bunch of non-logical information. There's always just going to be one favorite that we have, and that favorite will just become our new belief set. So that's how we get, and when I revision operators that satisfy have a semi-strict relation, I just call semi-strict revision operators. And so this gets us a characterization result. If we take the revision operator I just mentioned, we additionally require that the preference ordering is semi-strict, then the resulting operator is characterized by these 4 postulates. And that's kind of the goal that I set out to do. In traditional AGM, there's often these kind of characterizations where we use some set theoretic machinery to set up some functions, and then we have a bunch of syntactic postulates, and we want to try and get an exact map between them. And this is one such case here. So that seems like, I might be tempted to say, okay, well, yay, I'm done, but no. We might think that maximality maybe is too strong. We have a revision operator that's characterized by those things. That seems good, that seems nice. However, suppose we might have this one example. We start with a belief set, classical belief set, where P is a belief base for that belief set. Suppose we're wanting to move to intuitionistic logic. Well, the question is, should P be preserved through this revision? And the answer, we might think, might depend on how we obtain P. If P was deduced via intuitionistically invalid means, then we might want to not preserve P. So for example, if we originally believed not P, and then we only have P in this belief set because we deduced it from double negation elimination, then that might pose a problem for moving to intuitionistic logic. Because we obtain this information from intuitionistically invalid means, we probably shouldn't preserve it through the revision. Instead, we should preserve not P, which was the original kind of weaker non-logical information we started with. However, maximality doesn't allow us to do this. Maximality requires that we preserve as much non-logical information as without trivialization, and P and not P are intuitionistically consistent. They're not equivalent, but they are always consistent. And so on that basis, if we take one and we add the other, then it won't trivialize. Because maximality requires that we preserve all information that doesn't trivialize, it forces us to preserve both P and not P when moving to intuitionistic logic. And it turns out that even the slightly weaker revision operator that's not semi-strict, the original one, the basic one, still forces us to do this as well. The way that remainder sets are constructed, again, is somewhat maximal. We require that the candidate new belief sets be maximal with respect to non-logical information, and so every candidate new belief set will contain both P and not P. And because every candidate belief set will contain those, that means they'll also be contained in the resulting belief set, since the intersection will always preserve both of those being members of it. Okay, so we have this problem that maximality might seem like a good idea, and since we lose as little as possible. But there are certain situations like this where we might think, okay, well, maybe we should lose some non-logical information on grounds of logic. So how can we get a revision operator that allows us to do that? And the way we do it is pretty straightforward. We can do it in basically the same way as before. We just have a slightly weaker operator. Again, take inspiration from the partial meet operator approach, and we use a new remainder set to generate a weak revision operator. The W here stands for weak, and the remainder set that will be used for this weak operator is the same as the one for the basic operator, except that it doesn't require the candidate new belief sets be maximal with respect to non-logical information. Candidate new belief sets need to just be non-trivial closures of some subset of non-logical information. That subset doesn't need to be maximal. It could even be the empty set. And yeah, so that's the way we would generate this remainder set for the new operator. And it generates a much weaker operator. The way that this revision occurs, it's exactly the same. We generate a bunch of new candidates, but because there are so many more candidates and they're so much weaker, we can select favorites that are in ways in which we couldn't before. This operator satisfies the first three postulates: closure, coherency, and origin, but not maximality. In this case, we don't want it to satisfy maximality, so that's a good thing. And just returning to the example to show how this operator does its job, the way that we would go through this weak revision. So identify all the non-logical beliefs from the original belief set, which are just all the formulas that are classically equivalent to P. We would generate the candidate new belief sets, which would involve this collection of candidate belief sets is just, we take any subset of this collection of non-logical information and close it under intuitionistic logic. It's candidate new belief set, as long as it's not trivial. But in this case, none of them will be trivial. Then we can pick our favorite ones. And in particular, because we have this weaker construction of the remainder set, we can have candidate new belief sets that contain not P, which don't themselves contain P. And so we require of the preference ordering, in this particular case, that all of the candidate new belief sets which contain P come lower in the preference ordering than the ones that contain not P. The idea, just going back, is that if P was obtained from not P, then we want to make sure that not P is more preferred, since otherwise we would have P obtained by intuitionistically invalid means. And once we have our favorites, we just take their intersection. In this particular case, I think there's just going to be, I think there'll just be one, and that'll be their candidate belief set generated from not P. We take the intuitionistic closure of not P, and that'll be our new belief set. And so this weaker revision allows us some more nuance at the cost of strength. We can kind of capture these various ideas and specific situations by weakening the maximality requirement. And so we get this kind of spectrum of operators that we can create. On the one end, we have semi-strict revision, which is, in a sense, the strongest revision operator we can get. It preserves as much non-logical information as possible through the revision without being trivial. On the other hand, down here, we have weak revision, and it's very flexible. We can use it to model a wider range of situations, but it's also very, very weak. Without any further restrictions on the preference ordering, weak revision doesn't ensure that any non-logical information whatsoever is preserved. It's possible for any revision for you to lose all non-logical. When using weak revision, it's possible to lose all of your non-logical information in every revision, simply because it's so general. And so we might think, well, maybe there's a middle ground here. Maybe we can find some operator or operators that might kind of be like Goldilocks operators, you know, not too strong, not too weak, they're just right. I don't have a clear answer to what those operators might be, but I can give you a schema to generate operators in the event that you have a good idea and that you want to generate an operator that has a specific properties. So that operator here, let me just take the time. So that operator here is, I call P preserving operators. What we can do is we can vary the preference. We can start with weak revision and vary the preference ordering in such a way that it ensures the new belief set will always preserve some property P that you want the belief set to preserve. we do this by requiring that if P holds of some set of formulas X but not of Y, then X comes earlier in the ordering. And what we do, we generate the remainder set for weak revision as usual, but then this extra condition on the ordering ensures that all of the candidate new belief sets that possess the desired property come before all of the candidate belief sets that don't. And so that will ensure the new property the new belief set will possess the property in question, unless it doesn't. As long as so if the intersection property doesn't preserve P, then we need one more condition that the preference ordering gives us a unique favorite element. So in the event that intersection does preserve the property P, we don't need this requirement, but if intersection doesn't preserve the property, we do need the requirement. And that guarantees that the new belief set will possess the property in question. So just as a final kind of illustration of how this works, semi-strict revision, the strongest one, can be expressed with this schema. Weak revision can be trivially expressed with this schema because the property P is just like there's no additional constraints. But for the semi-strict revision, the additional property that we require is that property P holds of X, just in case. For any, given any belief set and non-logical information from that belief set and a new logic, if there's some superset of X, and any superset of X that's also a subset of non-logical information is trivial when closed under the new logic. So essentially here is we're just taking the extra requirements from the remainder set of semi-strict revision and imposing them on the preference ordering. So we get the same results, but we just do it via different means. In this case, we start with weak revision, we impose the extra conditions via the preference ordering and get the same favorites as if we constructed a stronger remainder set with a weaker preference ordering. In either case, assuming that the new relation is semi-strict, we get the same resulting belief set. And so this kind of schema, it seems very general. Yeah, and all of these operators satisfy the first three postulates because the P-preserving revisions are just based on weak revision. Weak revision satisfies these three. So any strengthening of weak revision will satisfy these three, or well, as long as it's weaker than semi-strict revision, it'll satisfy these three. And so finally, to wrap up, we might think what properties might be good or interesting. We have semi-strict revision, it's kind of the strongest. We have weak revision, it's kind of the weakest. Is there a middle ground? Maybe. I'm not quite sure. We can come up with specific operators for very specific situations. For example, like in the intuitionistic case, the P and not P. We can create an operator, an entire operator that ensures that not P comes before P. And so we might think that that operator would be good for moving to intuitionistic logic from logics that contain double negation elimination. That's a very specific case, but I'm not sure what kind of general properties we might want to hold of a revision operator. And I think that's, yeah, and so that's kind of the last thing I really have time to say. Yeah, thank you. There's various technical details we can go to in the break about AGM related stuff if desired. Yeah, thanks.